Good morning, everybody. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Michael Bortz. I am a teacher at a relatively large school in the Silicon Valley. I work at a school that is extremely mixed, both racially and socioeconomically. Um, but for this presentation, I'll be primarily focusing on a class that I've designed, my AP Environmental Science class, and going over some of the pedagogical tools I've developed for that class. In that class, I have predominantly um, quite a wealthy population. And so over the course of this presentation, I'm going to go over with you guys some of the things I've designed, some of the curriculum I've designed for my class to help specifically students with that um, background help involve themselves in uh, climate change and environmental justice. Um, my theoretical framework as a teacher comes probably more than anything from Paulo Freire. Uh, like many of you guys, I'm sure in teacher school, you had to read Pedagogy of the Oppressed, and I was really inspired by his methods. For those of you who aren't familiar with his methods, it basically boils down to the point of school should be to teach kids to go out and look at society, figure out what the messed up things are in our society, and then guide those students through a process of coming up with their own solutions to the problems rather than you as the teacher telling them what those solutions should be. Um, Frey has a bunch of other cool ideas in his book, but I'm predominantly going to focus on this one here. And so basically, his method is you go out into the local community, you find something the kids really are passionate about fixing, and then talk about how to fix it. Um, in my early career, I worked in a quite economically disadvantaged post industrial town, and this method I found to work really, really well. In this town, here's a picture of the actual oil refinery. There was a big oil refinery, and it was really easy to just look out the window, look at the big black cloud of smoke in the air, and go, hey guys, do you think this is bad? And most of my students indeed thought, hey, yeah, we hate this oil refinery in our backyard, and immediately wanted to do something about it. This also worked when we talked about things like poverty and lack of access to social services in the area. Students were immediately drawn to talk about these issues. And then when we moved on to talk about bigger global issues, things like Amazon deforestation, things like child labor, when we talked about factory farms, all of these things, no matter what we talked about, immediately the response from my student is, what can we do? No matter what the subject is, the question became, what do we do? Um, Now, that particular school was a charter school, and if you've ever worked at a charter school, you know how they can collapse. And so as that school collapsed, I ended up looking for a new job, and I ended up moving to the suburbs at the school I work at now. Um, and one of the things I noticed in that suburb was there actually weren't a lot of big systemic problems that impacted the students in my AP Environmental Science class specifically. I actually find Freya's method works really well in my biology classes where there are students experiencing these systemic problems. Um, but I usually only get one or two students in my AP Environmental Science class who are on the receiving end of some of these societal injustices. And so I figured, well, instead of just looking, maybe we don't have an opportunity to look at local injustices harming my students, but we certainly can look at global injustices. And so we started by looking at some global problems. Once again, same problems that I talked about with my Richmond kids. We talked about Amazonian deforestation. We talked about forced labor and child labor. We talked about factory farms. And when I introduce these, I want to be clear, my students are great people. They're human beings. We talk about these things. They would look sad. But when I go back and talk to my students afterwards, I was haunted over and over again by a specific question. Students would always ask me, well, why are we learning this? And as a teacher, this is, I think, the most important question we can ever answer for a student. Knowledge should it should be clear to students why they're here. If we want them to learn and be passionate about the curriculum, they certainly need to know and care about what they're learning about. And so I would push them like, what do you mean, why are we learning this? It seems obvious to me why we're learning about these things. Why don't you care about these things? And the response I got over and over again was, this isn't on the AP test. And so I surveyed my students and found out that 63% of them would rather do AP test prep than learn about these real world issues we were talking about. Now, to me, as an educator who's passionate about social justice, this A, kind of broke my heart, and B, saddened me a little bit. Um, but like a good scientist, rather than just give up, I formed some hypotheses about why this might be, and I set about to investigate these hypotheses. I came up with two ideas in retrospect. I don't think it's either of these ideas, but at the time, I came up with these two ideas. And I said to myself, well, either students just care more about their own well being and going to college than they do about the suffering of others, or part of me had this nagging suspicion that the kids wanted to study the AP test because their whole lives people had just told them the AP test was a big deal and super important. And I think they might have had this idea in their heads that it was the things on the AP test were what they needed to learn because those things were the most important. And at this point, I was inspired to incorporate some ideas from one of my favorite science educators, and I pulled in a little philosophy from one of my favorite philosophers, Carl Sagan. And Sagan has this really powerful idea that science is a tool we can use to fight propaganda. And since in my head, uh, sorry, anybody listening to this who might work for college boards, but in my head, college board is basically propaganda. And so I took some of Sagan's ideas and implemented them into my course to help students understand that maybe some of these things on the AP test were hegemonic ideas. And so rather than starting my course with some science knowledge or starting my class by talking about social problems, we started by looking at the College Board standards. And we went into the standards. We might look at something like the rule of tens, and then which says that every time you move up a step in a food chain, the energy decreases by 90%. And we would look at actual data sets. And when we looked at these actual data sets, we would see that, well, sometimes it decreases by 90%, but sometimes it decreases by 99%. Sometimes it decreases by 60%. Sometimes it decreases by 99.1%. We would get different numbers every time, and this number 90, it turns out, is really kind of arbitrary and based on a paper that's been discredited years ago, and yet it still exists in the College Board standards. And after going over a bunch of these standards, only once students started to ask themselves, hey, is this College Board curriculum really good? Then we didn't immediately jump into social problems, but we looked at science problems that were a little bit more open-ended and didn't have clear right and wrong answers, with the hope that my students would start to see academic problems not as things where you need to learn the right answer, but things where you need to have a discussion or think about things abstractly. And so we looked at things like climate change, and in this unit we try to make predictions about how the weather is going to change as a result of climate change, which is a hugely complicated topic where nobody who's being honest with themselves has a right answer. And only then, once they sort of started to wrap their head around this idea, did we start to introduce some social problems. And we start maybe looking at things like, well, what human uh, social norms, or what cultural norms, or what economic practices are contributing to some of these things we see in climate change. And only after all of that, after their minds have kind of been hopefully prepped, do we introduce things like problem solving. And only then at the end do we look at a big thing like deforestation or child labor and ask, with the hope that once they have this idea in their head, that they're not just there to blindly memorize things, that they would ask what their role could be in this problem. Now you might ask, does this work? And the answer is sort of. By the end of my class this year, hardly any students would have preferred memorizing AP standards as opposed to learning about real world problems. And I talked to these 4 students, and almost all of them just thought it was hard to think about things for themselves and just like the AP student standards, not because they thought they were better, but just because they were easy. Go figure. Um, but one of the big obstacles I ran into was that when we broke down some of the things that they believed in the past and looked at things like College Board and talked about where they were wrong, rather than just saying to themselves, oh, that's wrong, I wonder what I should believe instead, they just waited for me to tell them what to do. In my end of the year survey, when I asked them just a very general, how do you think this class can be improved? 22 out of the 66 of them said something to the effect of, I didn't tell them what to do about problems. I wanted them to come up with their own solutions. And so I think a lot of the students, while taking apart the AP curriculum, did help them think a little bit about maybe some of the things in our society are messed up. They didn't make that jump to this is what I should do about it or this is what I want to do about it. And finally, when I asked my students on their final surveys, what's a way you want to come and bring change and make the world a better place? Only 3 students talked about implementing any kind of systemic change. And so, what I actually think is going on here, now that I have some new data, I think I have a new hypothesis, is that my students look at these big giant problems and they've been conditioned their whole life to only think about their grades and only think about school and only think about college. And when I show them something like deforestation, they say to themselves, well, that's not a thing under the locus of my control. The grades are the only thing under my locus of control. And so next year, what I want to do is talk a little bit about privilege and power and talk a little bit about what things are in and out of their control, kind of in the middle of the unit, right in between introducing social problems and talking about students' roles in environmental problems. And what I'm hoping is this will help students understand that they actually do have some power. And while they can't change the entire systems that we live in, they can change things about those systems and hopefully grow up to want to implement those changes. Thank you for your time.